So the definition, or the way I've always described it, is really, and this may be a theme for the 2014, is it's a place, a society, an organization that embeds a culture of creativity in everything it does. That doesn't mean it's all wacky and only being creative all the time, because part of creativity on the one hand is being divergent in your thinking, opening out. The other part of it is closing down and letting things go through the reality checker. So I'm not just saying creativity is about having ideas. A creative idea is only one that actually exists in the real world. So in that sort of version, creativity is more than the arts and the creative industry. There's administrative, social creativity and political creativity too. And it's really, this notion of the creative city is about how, in a world of greater diversity, we feel more confident and competent in doing the things we do. So in some sense, it's an empowering way of looking at the world. It's saying we all have potential, that ordinary people, in that sense we're all ordinary, can make the extraordinary happen if we're given a chance. And I think there are enough examples everywhere to show that. So what a creative city is, it's the opposite of this bunker. This is Albania. I'm on my way to Albania, in fact. And there are 60,000 of these bunkers. So you can imagine that that society with lots of bunkers where you're always being looked at is not really providing the conditions within which you can think, plan, and act with imagination. Now, creativity is different in different contexts and periods. In the 19th century, it was the creativity of public health that was incredibly important for cities, developing sewage systems and so on. But today, I think the key focus of creativity, or not the A, is what we discussed yesterday, this crossing boundaries, either between artistic disciplines, between science and art and technology and things like that, between physics, biology and chemistry and so on. So it's really about thinking at the edge of your competence rather than the center. What you know, if you're a librarian, you know you're a librarian, that's fine, we know that. You run the children's section, but the good ideas often happen in relating to someone else. So I think that's a particular focus of creativity today. Now, one of the problems about this whole idea of being more imaginative, etc., is certainly in Britain, and I don't know if it's in Sweden too, is the rise of risk culture. And risk culture is often nullifying precisely the good ideas because someone has their risk policy. I don't know if you have your risk policy, but risk used to mean opportunity as well as risk. Now it only means the worst thing that ever happened, and that we will call the standard, and we will base our laws on the standard of the worst thing that ever happened, which means that the innovative capacity of organizations and places often reduces. So in the end, what I'm really saying is we're talking about a mental flexibility, and most importantly, that word there, within an ethical framework, because creativity can be used for good and bad purposes. So what is the direction it's being placed in? So if you had a metaphor in your mind, an image in your mind, it's more like jazz, and I know you've got a great jazz festival. I know about all these festivals now because I spent 3 hours with you. But jazz, in a way, is a good metaphor because it's very democratic. In the best sense, everybody can be a leader at a moment in that, and when the music works well, it's a good piece of music. So the metaphor is more jazz jam than a symphony orchestra with one conductor directing everything. So one of the big questions people obviously ask is, what is the role of cultural development as a whole, and within that, cultural institutions? Now I think, and this was very interesting because the message kept on coming across in my conversations over the last 2 days, is really this question of generating curiosity. I mean, a lot of people start off and say, we are the innovative city. Well, before you can be innovative and entrepreneurial and all these things that people talk about incessantly, you have to have people who, at the first stage of the game, are curious. So the first word, the important word, is curiosity. If you're curious, you might be imaginative. If you're imaginative, you might be creative. If you're creative, you might lead to creating an innovation, out of which may come an invention. So it's quite important, I think, to look at that. So I think the role of cultural development and institutions is to develop, in part, curiosity. And obviously, this is one of your shops. It's called Fantasia. I've forgotten what it's probably a hairdresser's. But anyway, it's in Umeå. But it's obviously about that type of thing. Hairdressing shops have great names, I'll just tell you. They're often called creative hair. You get the idea. Clearly, it's about that stretching, that broadening that I think that cultural development often forces us to do. I heard about an interesting project. What was it called? Verket. What was that thing called? A Kulturverket, their project. That was rather interesting. We saw the bus, yes, go past. And what I think is particularly interesting is the theme that kept on emerging, which was about dialogue here, kept on emerging. And I think that's actually an incredibly significant thing, because the art of conversation has actually declined dramatically. That's in Singapore. You probably can read it. But Singapore is another one of these cities that's saying we are a creative city and therefore wants unbounded dialogue. But I do think, therefore, that the cultural institutions, in their own ways, one is really talking about dialogue. And so the interesting question in terms of the physical nature of these institutions is how are they set up to, in a sense, foster that dialogue just physically? Are they able to do that? And one of the interesting things is, because we're in such a rational world, is that dialogue and that curiosity is obviously about having an expansive view of possibilities. And so often, though, there's always someone in the room, not in Umeå, I feel Umeå seems to be quite courageous, who's saying, oh, what's the detail, before you've even been able to explore the generality. And, you know, we're all practically, hopefully practical. We'll get to the detail a bit later. And unless that happens, we're often talking at complete cross purposes and not really getting down to, in the case of, let's say, Umeå, where is Umeå going in the future? How will it survive? And what will it do? And I think that thing about dialogue, I mean, here in the library you've got that section over there, and that's in the museum. I just found it quite interesting that you seem to have all these dialogue places, and I think that is a really strong point. Now the question is, to me, really, what does that physically look like in the future? Right, okay. That's one of your librarians, having a dialogue with the city. And obviously, in this question of dialogue, one of the issues that I want to talk about a bit is obviously the question of intercultural understanding. And I don't mean that only in an ethnic sense. Obviously, ethnicity is important, but also young, old, different views of life, and so on. So diversity in that slightly bigger sense. But this is an interesting example of a dialogue between a Christian art and a Muslim woman looking at that in the National Gallery in London. Or here is Lille, 2004 European City of Culture, pretending to be Mumbai. So that overlay is, this is the railway station. It doesn't look like a normally it looks like a railway station, but when you superimpose Mumbai on it, it looks like a crazy place. So that question of connection is obviously key. The other thing that I think is quite important is the question of ritual. And we had a conversation yesterday about losing your religion or something like that. Now clearly, even if we are losing our religion, there is the question of anchoring in some sort of sense. And one of the conversations we had yesterday, or I don't know, everything seems like one long day, but some day in the last few days, about what are the elements which are incredibly strong. And clearly the core elements, water and fire and all of those things, and light, are absolutely key. And this is a project in Providence, Rhode Island, which is fire. It's called Water Fire. And what happens is these fires, these boats collect these fires, and they then go and are put onto the river. And then there's music of all sorts of things, and events happen and so on. And this has become one of the most central gathering places. They do this about 20 times a year, where literally thousands and thousands of people come, and they do things like reflect, like that guy, wherever he is, here. So I think that's another dimension.